Okay, we're in Revelation chapter 6. This is where it gets real interesting, I guess is the word. And so I doubt that I'm going to get through all 11 verses tonight, but I want us to read the first 11 verses of that chapter. And we're going to talk about some of these symbols that people have talked about for years and years and years that jump out of Revelation, and many people don't know what they're talking about. You know, like the four horsemen, for example. Everybody heard the four horsemen of the apocalypse? You know, well, here they are. And, and if you ask most Christians, you know, y'all are Christians, who are the four horsemen of the apocalypse? I don't know. Is that in the Bible? You know, I'm talking about people who go to church every Sunday. So maybe we'll learn something tonight. So let's begin reading with verse 1. And I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with the voice of thunder, Come, or come forth. And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow. And a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering to conquer. And when he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, Come. And another, a red horse, went out to take him who sat upon it. It was granted to take peace from the earth, not to give peace to the earth, from the earth, and that men should slay one another, and a great sword was given to him. And when he broke the third seal, I heard the third living creature saying, Come, and I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat upon it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard as if it were a voice from the center of the four living creatures saying, A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. And when he broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, Come. And I looked, and behold, an ashen or pale horse. And I'll come back. I want to get that far at least. And he who sat upon it had the name of Death, and Hades was following with him. And authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth. And when he broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who have been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, wilt thou refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And there was given to each of them a white robe, and they were told that they should rest for a little while longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who were to be killed, even as they had been, should be completed also. Okay. Since we weren't here last Sunday night, and since you will kind of lose continuity if you don't catch up, let's try to catch up. The vision that we have here in chapter 6 continues the one that we have in the vision that began with chapter 4. So chapters 4 and 5, and so this vision continues. However, there is something that changes. The scene shifts. In chapters 4 and 5, where was the scene? It was in heaven. Now the scene shifts to the earth. Okay? And before we get into each one of the seals, and you note here that this is a scroll. And all that John is talking about so far, all that he is seeing so far, is the seals simply being broken. You have to break all 7 seals for the scroll to be open. So you're just breaking the seals, but there's much to learn just with that. The scroll itself, though, what's inside those seals that are going to be broken, we already have a pretty good idea of what's inside. We don't know all the details, and that's what Revelation is about. But the scroll itself involves the rest of the book of Revelation, the rest of John's revelation given to him by the risen Christ, and has to do with the consummation of the mystery of all things. That is, the goal or the end of history, both to those who are the overcomers, Christians, and those who will wear the mark of the beast, who are non-Christians. But what relationship do the seals have to this mystery that is unfolding? And that is the consummation of the history of the world. What relationship does it have? Well, to get into that, you'll notice, and this is why I read this, when the fifth seal is open, the martyrs underneath the altar cry out, How long basically they're asking, how long do we have to wait until we experience the vindication on those who have killed us for your sake. And then in verses 10 and 11, those same martyrs are told, a little longer. I'll get to that next Sunday night. And when the sixth seal is opened, the judgment then appears to be imminent. One more seal to open in verse 17. So it seems to indicate that there is some kind of time progression with the opening of these seals, that the seals represent, now listen, represent events that are preparatory to this final consummation of history, this final consummation of the end. These seals are preparatory. They represent the things that are going to happen until the end ends, until the end comes, to say it that way. And they also represent general conditions that prevail throughout the period. And some people, this is where there's great debate over what is this period of time. Is it just right before the world ends? Or is it, as it is my understanding of reading the New Testament revelation, the end began, as John said in chapter 1, the last days began with the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And so the last days have been coming ever since then. The seals then closely parallel the signs. This is something that a lot of people don't know. The seals closely parallel the signs of approaching end times that Jesus spoke of. Jesus spoke of these same things in Matthew chapter 24, in Luke chapter 21, in what is known as the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talked about the signs of the times, the things that are going to happen preparatory to the world ending and the coming back of the Son of Man. And in that discourse, the events of the last days, according to Jesus in that discourse, fall into three periods. Okay, here they are. Number one, he says, first of all, there will be false Christs and prophets, wars, famines, pestilences, earthquakes, death. He called them the beginning of birth pangs. This is the beginning of the end, so to speak. Secondly, he talked about the period of the Great Tribulation, which Jesus didn't call the Great Tribulation, by the way. He called it the Great Distress. And thirdly, the period after the distress of those days, where Jesus said, when the sun, the moon, and the stars will be affected, and then Christ will return. This parallel to major parts, what Jesus had to say in his Olivet Discourse, is so striking that it cannot be ignored. So the way to understand what we're taught in Revelation, especially here in this chapter, and with the bowls and with the trumpets, the best way to interpret what those symbols mean and what's going on in terms of time and everything else is to understand what Jesus had to say. He's the template for our understanding, okay? The events are similar then to those that occur with the trumpets and the bowls. In fact, some people think the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls are really the same things happening. They're just happening in deeper and deeper forms, and they may be. But you'll notice when we get to the bowls, the trumpets and the bowls, that those later and more severe judgments take place during those times. Moreover, how we reckon time, that is, the events preceding the end, can stretch out through the whole period from John's time until now, and can still be viewed as next, what John said in chapter 4, verse 1. That's what I believe. Okay, let's get to the horsemen. Okay, let's talk about the four horsemen. The four seals, the first four, I should say, are distinct from the last two because they describe four horses that are all of a different color, who have four riders, and all four of them are given different powers over the earth. By the way, this imagery has an Old Testament reference to it. If you did not know that, go back and read the visions of Zechariah in the Old Testament. In Zechariah's vision, horsemen in chariots were divine instruments of judgment on the enemies of God's people. That helps us to understand what these horses are about, who these riders are. And the colors, though, in Zechariah's vision, represented the 4 points of the compass. That's different in Revelation, though. And that helps us to understand how we are to see the horses and the riders. Each is sent by Christ through the instrumentality of the four living creatures into the world. The emphatic call to come that we see in verses 1, 3, 5, and 7, that emphatic call to come is viewed, it should not be viewed, I should say, as addressed to either John or to Christ, but it is addressed to each of the horsemen. In fact, it's a very dramatic call. In the ancient Near East of the day, there were all kinds of theaters that were performed in all kinds of large cities, and they had this huge outdoor theater called an amphitheater, which most of you know about. But they were big enough that chariots could run around in them. And so whenever the chariots, pulled by horses, obviously, were supposed to make their arrival, this cry, "Come," or "Come forth," was announced by whoever was emceeing these theaters in the amphitheaters. Which brings us to the first horse, the white horse. Okay, the white horse. This first horse and his color gives interpreters a whole lot of difficulty. One of the reasons is because he's white. What have we already learned in Revelation about white? White is associated with what? Huh? Purity, righteousness, and you'd be right. It is. White garments, if you go back to the letters to the churches, white garments were always put upon or worn by Christians who did not soil their garments, And so that is one of the reasons it gives interpreters a problem, is because white has always been associated with righteousness and goodness and everything else. However, this horse cannot be that. This horse, some people think this horse is Christ. Here are the problems with this horse being Christ, or rather I should say, here's why I believe, and many other commentators believe this too, that we should identify the white horse and the rider on it with the Antichrist and the forces of the Antichrist, because, first of all, these horses are together. They parallel each other. One follows the other. They have a relationship with each other. They are all four instruments of judgment. Underscore that. All four of them are instruments of judgment. The rider on the white horse, a rider on a white horse, appears in chapter 19. However, if you read, I don't want to take the time tonight to read these places. If you go home tonight and you read in chapter 19, we're told that the rider on the white horse in chapter 19 is faithful and true, and with justice he judges and makes war, in contrast with this rider who is not faithful and true and who wages war for unjust conquest. As for the Lamb, he is the one who opens the seals, and thus he cannot or would not be one of the riders. He's the one opening the seals, so he cannot be one of the riders. So it's obviously not the Lamb, the slain Lamb, who is the same Messiah, Son of God. Moreover, it would be inappropriate for the angelic beings who are crying out, "Come," for each one of these horses, for them to call forth Christ or His servants. Christ calls forth the angels. The angels don't cry forth for Christ. It's a matter of supremacy and sovereignty. And the bow that is in His hand itself would naturally be connected to the enemy, as it is elsewhere in the Bible, with the enemy of God's people. And finally, the event mentioned in the Olivet Discourse, the first event that Jesus mentions in the Olivet Discourse has to do with false Christ and false messiahs. So why would this horse and the rider upon it not represent the Antichrist and the false prophets and the forces of the Antichrist? That is the best way to understand this horse and the rider upon this horse, because they seek to conquer the followers of Christ. They are going forth to conquer the followers of Christ. John senses that these persecutions are already present in his day, and that they will culminate in a final and more severe form as time goes on, especially right before the end. So each of the four seals represents conflict aimed at Christians. That's going to be hard for some people to understand. Each of the four seals represent conflict aimed at Christians. Why? To test and to sift out false disciples. I'll go on in a minute, but let me say this. One of the reasons that I believe history is drawing to a close, that the end is more near than I ever thought it would be, is because increasingly, not just in America, but all across the world, but increasingly in America, Christians are being sifted and tested in terms of genuine belief. Something that Patsy and I have talked about that we've noticed with people our age, and I've noticed it with several friends of mine who have taken early retirement, moved back to where they grew up. Many of them have been churchgoers, well, not many, but a lot of them have been churchgoers most of their life. And let me tell you what's happening with a lot of people my age. Little by little, they've just kind of dropped out of church. They don't go anymore. It's not that they don't not believe anymore. It's just not important to them anymore. There is a sifting going on. And I don't mean going to churches is, the only measurement to sift belief, but I am saying that there's a lot of sifting going on. I heard this, and I hope I don't offend you with this, but I heard this not too long ago. A well-known Christian leader made a statement, and he was right when he made it, that we have now come to the age, we've now come to the place where Christians are going to have to decide whether to accept what the Bible has to say about homosexuality or accept what the culture has to say about homosexuality, and we're being forced to make a choice between the two. And we're being sifted right now. Many Christians do not know this. That agenda has become so much at the forefront that Christians can't seem to win no matter how we try to approach this particular issue. You cannot even have a civil conversation with people about this issue. Believe me, I've tried. You cannot even engage in a civil conversation with people about this issue. But this is not going to be the only issue. There are going to be more and more issues that are going to come up where increasingly Christians are going to have to decide you cannot stay on the fence anymore. You can't stay on the fence and hope that the culture likes you and and you can kind of blend in with the rest of the culture and not be out here and sticking out like a sore thumb as a Christian. That is increasingly not going to happen. And so some of the things, this whole idea about these four seals are being opened and these riders, the four horsemen of the apocalypse are going into the world, is conflict aimed at Christians to sift and to test false disciples. And there are a lot of false disciples in our churches today. This interpretation does not eliminate the fact that the seals may also refer to judgments on humankind in general, but since the fifth seal is that of the cry of martyred Christians, particularly probably the thought of Christian persecution, belongs to the first four seals. Why else would the fifth seal be about martyred Christians? Each of them unleashes events. Each seal, each horseman, unleashes events that separate false belief from true. We'll get into that in just a second. And go back and read what Jesus had to say in Luke 21, which is Luke's account of the Olivet Discourse, when Jesus talked a little bit more in that account about the destruction of Jerusalem and how it would make Jews sit up and take notice. Well, the white horse, which is where we are, is released to do one thing: conquer. That's his purpose. And as he goes forth, judgment falls on the unbelief of Israel. That's why by the time that John was given this to write, Jerusalem had been destroyed. If you remember anything about your biblical first century history, in 70 A.D., the Romans just finally got sick and tired of the Jews. I mean, they'd had it with the Jews. And so they leveled the city. In fact, the order given by the emperor was one stone cannot sit on top of another. So if you had two bricks sitting on top of each other, It was a violation of the order given by Rome. That's how much he wanted it leveled. He wanted done with the Jews. He wanted done with that whole region where, the rest of the Roman Empire oftentimes was peaceful, except this one place. And so already that judgment has been seen on the unbelief of the Jews for rejecting the Messiah. And by the time that John was writing Revelation, that had already taken place, at least in the way I understand the time frame. While at the same time, there is also a testing of believers to separate the chaff from the wheat. The bow itself in the hand of the rider on the white horse suggests forces that are opposed to Christians. And the crown suggests the victory that is going to be placed upon the rider of the white horse and the forces arrayed against Christians. Now here's what throws a lot of people. The white horse, okay, it says, where was I? Verse 2. The last sentence after if you have a text that has the punctuation. And a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and conquering. I need to back up, and he said, he was told to go out to conquer. Actually, the word was, he was given. It means he was given permission to go out to conquer. Who's he going to conquer? Christians. How do we understand that? He was given is the formula for sovereign permission to carry out acts that from a human point of view seem contrary to God's character, but nonetheless they accomplish His will. The rider on the white horse may point to attacks on false Jews, on the assault of Christians by pagan religionists, persecutions by Rome, as well as all future limited victories over the church by Satan. While verse 2 would have been very sobering for those first century Christians who first heard this message, who first read this message, or had it read to them, it will also encourage them, provided they understood that the Lamb had permitted it for their testing and their suffering. Jesus said, the wheat is going to be separated from the chaff, sheep is going to be separated from the goats. How are we going to know who's true, who's faithful, who's real, who's not? Of course, I don't have to know. It's not my business. But at some point in time, in some point in human history, everybody's going to know who's true, who's not. How are we going to know? Suffering has always been the counterpoint where Christians have been suffered and tried and tested. Always. Now here's the positive about all that. I've said this before, some of you know this. Christians in the first century were persecuted literally unmercifully. All the persecutions that have happened of Christians since then have not been as widespread as the persecutions in the first century because they were concentrated primarily on Christians. Christians were enemies of the Roman state, and they were persecuted unmercifully. And yet, by the 3rd century, the Roman Empire, at least in name, was Christianized. No Christians took up arms. No Christians went off to battle. And yet, they literally won over a culture. How did they do that? And the answer is, it was during this time of terrible persecution that real Christians were separated from those who weren't, and the real Christians made people, even the people who were making them suffer, sit up and take notice. There must be something real, there must be something right about what these people believe. Since that time, every period of persecution has produced a revival in the church. Go back and read your Christian history. Every period of severe persecution has produced a revival in the church. But every period of prosperity has produced a decaying effect upon the church. The worst thing that's ever happened to the church is prosperity. It kills us. We don't know how to handle it. So it's coming to America, to a theater near you. The theater is our country. But anyway, let's move on. Okay? In the midst of the seeming defeat by their enemies, though, these first century Christians could trust that ultimately Christ would be the victor, as it says in chapter 17, verse 14. Go home and read it tonight. All right, let me get through the next three horses real quick. The second seal comes with a red horse in verses 3 and 4. Now, what do you think red symbolizes? Well, this one's pretty easy. Red symbolizes war and bloodshed. That's why it symbolizes literally slaughter. He's given a large sword, we're told, because the number that he kills is so great. Now, this may be a reflection of Nero, the Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians, or those Christians who were slain under Domitian, who was another emperor, his persecution. Either one, depending on when you date the writing of John's revelation, or the revelation to John, those were two emperors who persecuted Christians probably the worst. And so this is what the red horse is about. He kills. He slaughters. That's why the horse is red. Then we get to the third horse, which is a black horse, verses 5 and 6. What does black symbolize? Remember the terrible plague that took place in the Middle Ages? What did they call it? They called it the Black Plague. Why? Because behind the plague came some other things. Behind the pestilence came some other things, namely poverty and famine. For example, if all the people in the village died out, or most of the people in the village died out, there wasn't anybody to tend the crops. Therefore, there was nothing to eat. And so the black horse symbolizes the effects of war and bloodshed. What are the effects of war and bloodshed? Sorrow, mourning, desolation. Why do people wear black at funerals? Some people still do. Because it represents mourning. The black horse represents the effects that follow war and bloodshed. The scales in his hand probably refers to two things. It refers to the inflation that these people are going to experience during this period of time, and the conditions of famine under which they're going to have to suffer. We're told that a quart of wheat could be bought with a denarius. Now, what a quart of wheat was, it was equivalent to what a person generally ate for a day to stay healthy. A quart of wheat, all right? The reason barley is here is because when people were very, very poor, in order to stretch out their wheat supply or their bread supply, they mixed in barley, which doesn't taste very good with wheat, I'm told. I don't know. To make it last a little bit longer. And so this is what the scales are, because these scales show the time of scarcity. It's poverty and famine. And they go hand in hand. And this part about not damaging the oil and wine, by the way, the oil is the oil that comes from olive trees. Okay, that's the oil, okay? So how do we interpret this? Well, there are two ways to interpret it. You can take either one, and you'll be fine. Some people interpret them as oil and wine were luxuries that were not necessary for bare survival, and so meaning that the rich would have them while the poor were starving. The rich always seem to escape times of scarcity, or a lot of rich. Or it may refer to the extent of the famine. Sometimes a drought that may affect the grain, may kill the grain, may not be severe enough to hurt the vines or the trees. And so the third seal probably brings poverty for sure, but maybe only a partial, not an exactly severe famine, at least not yet. Which brings us to the fourth horse. Causes a lot of people problems. It says a pale horse. If you read the Greek New Testament, it probably ought to read a green horse. Anybody ever heard this before? This is not really a surprise. A green horse. And let me tell you why. The word pale in the Greek New Testament, I'm not just making this up. You can go find this out from somebody else. The word pale in the Greek New Testament denoted a yellowish green color. The light green of a plant, but more importantly, what a person would look like if they were sickly. People tell me, "You feeling okay? The reason they say this to me is because I look pale to them. And because I look pale, I look sickly. I'm sure that happens to you as well. That pale color is sort of a yellowish green. And I don't know if you've seen people in extremis who are at the point of dying. They look gray or they look yellow-green, depending on what their disease is. That's what this word means. It's not pale in the sense of off-white. That's not what this word means. It's very clear in the Greek New Testament. So, why this color? Why a pale horse? The color fits in well with the name of its rider. What is the name of its rider? Death. And so pale fits in with the name of the rider. This probably then refers to the death that results from all this pestilence and plague, which, by the way, often follow famine. Whenever people are starving to death and they die, because people did not know how to practice sanitary conditions in those kinds of times, bodies piled up, they were thrown in ditches, they were thrown in water supply, and then plague took place, and all kinds of pestilence took place, and sickness and illness. And by the way, there's still many places around the world today that this still happens, you know. And the United States Army, I'm part Native American, so this really bothers me, but they knew how to defeat the Indians. They learned it from some of the Native American tribes. But what they would literally go do is they'd kill a few animals and throw it in their meager water supplies. And sometimes they would do it and then take the animals back out so they didn't know what they were drinking until they got sick and died. It was a common practice that the United States Army used to exterminate Native Americans. But then some Native American tribes did the same thing. So, we're also told, he says, that Hades, note this, the fourth seal. He says in verse 8, "And I looked and behold a pale horse, and he who sat on the name Death, and Hades was following with him." Now, what did we earlier say Hades was? I'm not going to get into that whole discussion again. Hades is the abode of the dead. You can even say grave and you'd be okay. Gehenna is hell. That's what Jesus talks about, Gehenna. Hades and hell are not the same thing, and there's definitely not purgatory. They're just simply a general reference to where the dead go. Where do dead bodies go? They go to the grave. Now, a lot of people are into cremation today, but nevertheless, that was the practice in that day and time. And so, following this horse, the pale rider, I should say, on this horse, or the green horse, the rider, named Death, was the grave following behind him. Well, that makes sense. Where he goes, death happens. The grave is following behind him. Whether on foot, or on the back of the same horse, or on a separate horse, we're not told. But there seems to be, by the way, an increasing intensity in these judgments as they're carried out by these various agencies. The sword, which refers to human violence and famine and plague, and now these people are even left to the wild beast of the earth. They have no protection from the wild beast of the earth. Now, I'm going to stop there except to say, look at verses 9 and 11 real quick, because I want to get into this next Sunday night about the martyrs a little bit more. But the one thing I'm told, the one thing I want to get into, is that the martyrs in verses 9, 10, 11 are crying out for justice to be carried out on those who killed them. And they're told to wait a little longer. Why are they told to wait a little longer? I'll get into more of this next Sunday night, but let me just tell you real quickly. Because the full number of martyrs has not been met yet. There are still many others to be martyred. And when all who will have died or will have given their lives, if they had to, for the sake of Christ, when all have been martyred, or all have been come in, then Christ will vindicate His saints. He's not going to do it piecemeal. Do it for this group and then wait a little while. Do it for this group, wait a little while. The full number is going to come in. And when all the martyred saints have been killed, then the saints will be vindicated. Remember, one of the themes of Revelation is this thing. It's not just, well, let me just say it this way. One of the themes of Revelation overall is the theme of justice. And part of justice is those who were the enemies of God's people, those who were God's enemies, those who killed or persecuted God's people will have justice visited upon them. That's what the saints are crying out for. They're not necessarily crying out for these people to be killed. They're crying out for vindication, justice. Because if you were sitting where they were sitting, it looks like those who were unbelievers are winning the day. That has been true throughout history, where it looks like the unbelievers are winning the day. But in the end, when it all comes to the end, the whole world and all who ever lived in it will see the truth that has always been the truth, whether they want to see it or not. Remember what I shared with you before? Later in Revelation, we are told that when the end comes, that again, at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus Christ is Lord. However reluctantly and hostilely those who do not believe will do it, they will have to do it. Because there is no other response to the truth. Let's pray together. God, we're thankful for your word, although sometimes it troubles us. But then being troubled is the way that we take our questions and our rumblings within to you and let you sort them by the power, the witness, and the interpretation and the influence of your Holy Spirit in our own lives and hearts. But one thing is very real, Lord. Your justice will be seen for all of creation to know and to see. And even though your people may suffer here on this earth and have been suffering for centuries upon centuries and even millennia, there will come a time where your people will be vindicated. Justice will be visited upon those who persecuted your people, because you are a just God, along with being a loving God. You are both. And only you, God, can balance the two in such a perfect way. That's what we look for. That's what we long for. And that is what we know to be true. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.